Welcome to Rise Up, biblical teaching to strengthen your heart and deepen your faith.
We are beginning a brand new sermon series in the book of Nehemiah. Over the next several weeks together, we're going to learn about the work that God called Nehemiah to do and how his story can be an example in our lives. And so in this series, we're going to be challenged to find our calling, and we're going to be given the tools and the encouragement to live with purpose. Well, my name is John, and I pray that through our time together, your heart grows stronger and your faith grows deeper. This morning, as we look at Nehemiah chapter 1, we're going to be challenged to stand in the gap, to lean into the things that break God's heart, and to position ourselves to be used for God's purposes. You know, standing in the gap means being a voice for those who are unheard. It means coming alongside someone when they are in need and hurting. It's responding even if you feel like you're the only one who seems to care. But I want to give a little bit of background before we get into Nehemiah's story. You see, the Israelites were God's chosen people. So if we go all the way back to the book of Genesis in chapter 12, God calls Abraham. And in verses 2 and 3, he says, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you." And God was faithful to the Hebrew people throughout the generations. He is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and so on through all the generations. And it was under King David that Israel became a really major power with military prowess. It was then under David's grandson Rehoboam that the kingdom split. There were 10 tribes that formed the northern kingdom called Israel, and 2 tribes that formed the southern kingdom known as Judah. Now we know that a kingdom divided cannot stand, and eventually both of them were conquered by their enemies. Israel was conquered first by Assyria, and Judah was taken captive by Babylon. We learn about this in the Bible. 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 8 through 10 describe the Babylonian invasion. And in fact, it describes the breaking down of the walls in Jerusalem. It says this: "Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace and all the houses in Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army under the commander of the imperial guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem." Now, a few years later, Persia conquered Babylon. And biblical figure, the king of Persia, his name was Cyrus. And by God's divine order, he used Cyrus, king of Persia, to send back some of the Jews who were living in exile. He sent them back to Jerusalem. In fact, he tells them to rebuild the temple. We learn about this in the book of Ezra. If you would look at chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, you would read that. So the temple in Jerusalem has been rebuilt. The problem is the walls of the city still lie in ruins. And so here we arrive 90 years later, and we're at the book of Nehemiah and the beginning of this story that we will learn together. So let's turn in our Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 1, and this is from the ESV. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. "Now it happened in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel." Now, the 20th year refers to the 20th year of the reign of the current king. And this was King Artaxerxes. We know this from chapter 2 and verse 1. Now, he is a well-documented figure. This is the son of the Persian king who chose Esther as his wife. The 3 post-exilic books in Scripture are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And so Esther has happened concurrently with this, or I should say, it has happened just prior to this. This means that the king, Artaxerxes, would be the stepson of Queen Esther. Now, we don't know the relational dynamic there, but to put this in context, this would be the next generation in Persia. Now, Esther grew up as a Jew in captivity in Susa. Nehemiah finds himself in the same boat. He's a Jewish exile growing up under Persian rule, and he finds himself there in Susa. It's the capital city of the empire. In fact, it would have been the central hub of the whole known world. And if you're wondering where this is today, it's in modern-day Iran. Well, we see if we jump down to verse 11, we're in Nehemiah chapter 1, that he is cupbearer to the king. Now, what is a cupbearer? Well, a cupbearer is the guy who tasted the king's food and drink before he passed it on to the king. In case anyone had in mind to poison the king. The cupbearer essentially is the guinea pig. Tastes good to me. Go ahead, king. But for as scary as that sounds, this actually was a really good job. I mean, everybody knows about the cupbearer. So attempts to kill the king through poisoning would have really been minimized. And this would have been a position of honor. I mean, he is serving in the king's court. He was close to the king. He was trusted by the king. I view it as he's kind of like a bodyguard. I mean, he's right by the king. Before anything goes to the king, he's checking it. I imagine him stepping into a room before the king comes in, kind of sweeping through the room to check to see, like, hey, it's all clear. Come on in, king. So he is making sure there are no dangers posed to the king. And he would have offered advice to the king. He would have conversed about royal affairs. So he's the cupbearer to the king. Let's keep reading. We're in Nehemiah chapter 1, and verse 2 says, Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. Now, Nehemiah has never been to Jerusalem. He grew up in Susa, and that is over 800 miles from Jerusalem. He's never seen the temple. He's never seen the city walls, but he's heard of them. In fact, he knows that Jerusalem is the city of God. He knows that that is where his ancestors worshiped Yahweh, the one true God. Now, it's been 160 years since they were conquered and this captivity began. But they have not forgotten their holy city. Psalm 137 is a psalm of captivity. It says, By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Now, Nehemiah's brother Hanani had been to Jerusalem, and so Nehemiah wants to know how he found it. And so he begins to question him about the people and about the city. And so in verse 3, we see the answer. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates destroyed by fire. Well, this is just the worst possible news. How can this be? Now, there have been 2 waves of exiles that have returned at this point. I mentioned the one wave that Cyrus sent, but there's been a second group that's gone back to Jerusalem. And they've been there for 90 years. The Jews have literally been in Jerusalem for an entire generation, an entire lifetime, and the walls have still not been rebuilt. What this would have meant was their enemies could have come and gone just as they pleased. The surrounding tribes and peoples, that they could come and take whatever they wanted from Jerusalem. They could attack without warning. So the people, the Jews, were vulnerable. They're without defense. Now listen, I realize that as I'm talking about building a wall in the year 2019, it is hypercharged politically. Now, but before any of us go headfirst into why there should or should not be a wall between the United States and Mexico, I want us to realize that Jerusalem and the people of God in the Old Testament are equivalent to the church today, to those who follow Jesus, the globe over. Now, at the center of worship for the Jewish people would have been the temple in Jerusalem. That was the hub of their worship and their community, the center. Well, we're told that our bodies are now temples inhabited by the Spirit of God. And so I'm challenged by the ways that I have let my own defenses down, the ways that I've not been on guard or watching, the ways that the enemy has access to come and go in my life because the walls aren't up. Now that's the image here for us, for the church, that we must allow Christ to build us up and to fortify us so that we're not weak and susceptible to spiritual attack. So the book of Nehemiah is not so much a case study in 21st century national foreign policy as much as it is an illustration of broken lives in need of Christ's touch, and about the story of a brave man who followed God's leading and lived with purpose. Well, let's keep reading. We're in Nehemiah chapter 1. This is verse 4. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. Nehemiah is stirred up by the needs of his people. He's moved by this injustice. His life is fine. He has choice foods, fine clothing. He has all the comforts and luxuries of palace life. But God's holy city lies in rubble. And it was that moment that Nehemiah knew that his life had a greater purpose. He hasn't completed the task. He hasn't even begun it, all right? But it begins with a heart shift from my safety, my security, my comfort, my pleasure. And maybe you were with us last Sunday and you recall us being challenged by that, to stop chasing after comfort. It begins with a heart shift where I've moved away from my own comfort, security, and safety, and I'm more interested in pursuing something greater, that there is some injustice, a need, a tragedy, some brokenness, something wrong in the world that's unsettling to me. And so what we're going to see as we study the rest of Nehemiah chapter 1 is we're going to see 3 statements that Nehemiah makes. What's interesting as you read the book of Nehemiah is it's written really in a first-person perspective. It's sort of a diary or a journal or memoir, if you will, written from the perspective of Nehemiah. And from these 3 steps, we're going to see Nehemiah standing in the gap. And so what I'd like to do with the rest of the time we have together is to look closely at the process Nehemiah undergoes as he transitions from cupbearer to wall builder. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about building the wall in weeks to come, but from what you know of Nehemiah, was he a licensed contractor? Was he a skilled mason or a master builder? I mean, did he have a truck that said licensed, bonded, and insured on the side? No. What he had was purpose. And it all began because he cared enough to ask. And that's really the first step that he took. He says, I asked.
You have been listening to Rise Up, biblical teaching to strengthen your heart and deepen your faith. To find more resources, go to johnrisner.net.